Welcome to Hardly. Each book is distilled into 3 stories, giving you the key ideas in minutes. Today we study together G.R. Berridge's Outposts of Diplomacy, a history of the embassy in which we probe into the evolution of embassies from temporary envoys to permanent institutions in modern diplomacy. G.R. Berridge is Professor Emeritus of International Politics at the University of Leicester and a Senior Fellow of the Geneva-based Diplo Foundation. Don't go away. Hurdley, the editor, will be right back with the story. We begin with the story of Venice in the 15th century. As political turmoil swept across the Italian peninsula, the city-states needed more than temporary envoys to manage their alliances and intelligence gathering. Venice was ahead of its time in understanding this need. It was a critical period, and one key event was the Venetian Senate's decision to establish permanent diplomatic representatives, a bold move at a time when envoys were typically dispatched only for short-term missions. The Venetian ambassador Contarino was appointed to the papal court in Rome around 1431, a pivotal position for Venice's interests in religious and political matters. His prolonged stay allowed him to weave a web of connections and gather intelligence that an ordinary envoy couldn't have amassed. His presence meant that Venice was continuously informed, able to respond swiftly to changing alliances and plots. Contarino's long-term post also offered him the unique advantage of nurturing relationships over time, something special envoys could never accomplish. However, it wasn't easy. He had to gain the trust of local power brokers and navigate complex political landscapes, all while maintaining Venice's reputation. A line from the book captures this perfectly. A resident ambassador had time to familiarize himself with his environment, see with his own eyes, and cultivate important contacts. In many ways, this was how Venice managed to stay ahead of its rivals during turbulent times. The lesson here is simple. Long-term presence allows deeper relationships to form, turning short-term challenges into opportunities. Following Venice's example, we move to 16th century England, where Henry VII employed a different strategy. England, relatively isolated from continental politics, was slower to adopt resident embassies. However, the appointment of Pietro Contarini, a Venetian merchant, as the first English resident ambassador to Spain in 1490 marked a turning point. Henry VII understood that Contarini's background as a merchant meant he was well positioned to gather crucial commercial and political intelligence. This wasn't a noble diplomat, but someone who had lived among the people and understood their ways. As he settled into his role, Contarini's business acumen helped England negotiate trade agreements that laid the foundation for later diplomatic successes. His residency allowed him to become familiar with the Spanish court and gain critical insights into its politics, information that couldn't have been gathered by a short-term envoy. But Contarini faced challenges in gaining credibility as a non-noble. He had to constantly prove his worth, which he did through the steady acquisition of crucial information, slowly building England's influence in Spain. His success teaches us that diplomacy isn't just about power and titles, but about understanding people and context. By the end of his stay, England had secured favorable trade terms with Spain, demonstrating that strategic patience and the right person for the job can achieve remarkable outcomes. This brings us to the last story, one of remarkable tenacity. In 1507, Ferdinand of Spain appointed his daughter, Catherine of Aragon, as England's resident ambassador. Unusual for the time, Catherine, a princess, took on a role that required her to navigate both diplomatic and personal matters. She had been in England for some time, hoping to marry Henry VIII, and the ambassadorship placed her in a delicate position, negotiating not only for her father's political interests, but also for her future. Without formal training and in a foreign land, Catherine handled complicated negotiations, showing remarkable tact. She developed a network of informants within the English court and regularly communicated intelligence to Spain. However, Catherine's role was further complicated by her personal stakes in the marriage negotiations. This dual responsibility placed her under immense pressure. As the book notes, she was hampered by her lack of a confidential secretary and above all by her sex and the abnormality of her position. Yet, despite these limitations, she managed to serve Spain's interests effectively. Her experience highlights that even in the most unusual circumstances, diplomatic success is possible through resilience and adaptability. The culmination of Catherine's efforts was her eventual marriage to Henry VIII, symbolizing both personal and political triumph. Each of these stories, from Contarino's long stay in Rome to Contarini's commercial diplomacy in Spain, and Catherine's dual role as ambassador and future queen, shows the importance of adaptability in diplomatic history. Embassies evolved from temporary to permanent institutions not just because of necessity, but because those who were sent adapted, learned, and found ways to thrive in foreign environments. Long-term engagement allowed these ambassadors to build relationships, gain trust, and influence outcomes in ways that would have been impossible in short-term missions. As the editor of Hardly, learning from these stories teaches us that the future of diplomacy might lie not in forceful negotiations but in deep-rooted connections and long-term commitments to understanding foreign cultures and systems. Each story comes from the most representative real-life cases selected by the Hardly team from this book. If you wish to dive deeper, we recommend purchasing the full book. In examining the evolution of embassies from temporary envoys to permanent institutions, one striking story highlights the resilience and adaptation that have defined diplomacy. In 1621, Sir Thomas Roe, England's ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, arrived in Constantinople at a time when diplomatic relations were fraught. The French ambassador had long been regarded as the most important European diplomat in the city, but Roe, backed by James Berridge, sought equality for the English mission. Roe faced intense resistance, not only from the French but also from local Ottoman officials who were accustomed to prioritizing French interests. Despite the challenges, Roe built alliances with the Venetian and Dutch ambassadors, uniting them to form a formidable bloc against French dominance. He worked tirelessly to maintain England's commercial agreements with the Ottoman Empire and even facilitated cooperation between the Christian ambassadors in a predominantly Islamic capital. His diplomatic persistence paid off, and England's influence grew, laying the groundwork for stronger future relations with the Ottomans. This story reinforces the key point. Permanent diplomatic presence allows for building strategic relationships over time, which can shift the balance of power. Diplomacy is not about immediate wins, but about cultivating influence in ways that cannot be achieved through short-term missions. As the editor of Hardly, through this lesson, we can reflect on how long-term diplomatic engagement shapes the world stage, allowing nations to adapt and thrive in complex global systems.